In today's video, guys, I'm going to be showing you how to diagnose a no crank or no crank, no start. Basics I want to cover are just how the system works for starting and what components you want to check with your multimeter and or test light. If you don't have a multimeter, you might be able to get by with a test light. But I come to find this problem quite a bit on a lot of lawn tractors. People will turn the key, either nothing will happen, it'll click, or it'll crank and not start. So we're going to start with the basics, the battery. So this battery here has a date on it of 3/2019, so it's pretty new. And I know we charged the battery on this, but you'll probably see some of the people's batteries, they're going to be a couple years old. You'll see a bunch of green corrosion on the terminals. That's always a bad sign because you're already losing voltage when you have all that corrosion. So you always want to start with a fresh battery and go from there. If you got a poor battery, you can try to do a volt drop test, basically taking your multimeter leads, going from positive and the negative terminal with your leads, and have somebody, or if you have clip-on leads, you can clip them on, have somebody or yourself crank it over and see how many volts it drops. If you get below 9.6 volts on the battery while you're cranking, you already know the battery is going to be part of the problem because it's already dropping so many volts. If it stays above 9.6 or 9.6 or better, you can't blame the battery. You can just keep going further. So that's a good test to do, a volt drop across the battery terminals, guys. Next, I would move on, check. With the initial checks, I would also check ground connection. So make sure you have no corrosion on your ground. Here, this ground, follow your ground wire. Usually it's going to go to the engine mount bolt or the frame somewhere. This particular model happens to be grounded on the frame. You guys can't see. Maybe you can see. It's way back on the other side of that blue fuse, kind of on the frame rail. And I know it's clean, so that's good. So do that when you check in, looking at the battery and the overall condition of the battery, and doing your volt drop test on the battery. Check the ground. Make sure it's tight. You want a tight connection. Make sure it's not loose. And see if it's not corroded, because you always want to clean the corrosion on those cables first. The ground's pretty important on the starting system. If you don't have a good ground, you're going to be chasing yourself, and it might have just been a bad ground the whole time. So always make sure that connection's clean, tight, and you should be good to go from there. I forgot to add in there, guys, with your initial battery check, and if you're getting nothing when you turn the key to the start position, I would check your safety switches first with the battery, obviously. So usually there's a parking brake one, which should be connected to your foot pedal. You got a seat switch, which is under the seat. That one's bypassed right now. And then there is a blade switch. So usually when you engage the PTO, it will not let you start it unless it's disengaged. And on a manual engagement PTO, there's probably a little switch on the back side of the arm. So usually it might crank with the seat switch off. It just will kill spark. And sometimes it's tied into the starting system. So it kind of depends on the tractor if it's tied into the ignition system or the starting system. So always check the safety switches, make sure everything's disengaged, parking brakes on, because that could be a simple thing that they forgot to do, and all of a sudden it works. So usually you'll get nothing. You won't get a click or anything when a safety switch is positive cable from your battery is going to go to your starter solenoid on one terminal. I'm going to try to get a view of it from in here. Okay. So your starter solenoid is that object right there where there's a black and a white wire coming out of it. On top of that, you're going to have one thick red wire usually. Not always. Somebody could have changed it, but it's usually red to one top post, and the other post is going to have another one that goes right to your starter motor. Now, if you're getting nothing, you want to take your key switch and try to crank it. If you get nothing, not even a click, take your meter, put it down on that top post where the battery comes in from, or battery to solenoid on that wire, and then check if you have 12 volts, because you should always have 12 volts no matter what if the key is on or off. That'll tell you if the connection is good, or you can do a continuity test, but make sure you got 12 volts or at least 10 to 9.6, something like that, on that one post where the battery lead comes in. Then the solenoid, go back to the solenoid, and then you're going to see a wire coming into the solenoid, usually on the side on one of the studs. there's going to be a ground, and then there's going to be a positive with positive voltage on it. So basically, if you have a multimeter or a test light, ground one of your leads on the battery, which is probably the best option, and then have somebody, or if you have clip-on leads, clip it on to that one that is not going to ground. It kind of depends. Usually it should be, might have a white with a red stripe or something like that. I'm going to try to get you guys in there, but it'd be up in here. Now I think that blackish one would be the ground, so the other side is going to be the hot terminal. Now when you have the key in the crank position, you should see at least 9.6 to 10.2 for voltage there. If you don't, you have a problem either in the key switch or a safety switch is still holding up and not allowing the current to flow. You could also have a bad fuse depending on the schematic and how it's wired. So check the fuses too. And then the key switch, I can do a different video on how to check the key switch, but basically when you unplug that terminal on the back, you can actually take the key switch right out of there. And you're just checking to make sure it has continuity in the certain terminals in the positions of the key switch. So the basics I'll give you, when it's in the stop position, you should have continuity between the M terminal and the G terminal, which is magneto and ground. So when it's in the off position, those should have continuity. When it's in the run position, you might have continuity with lights and battery, and possibly the magneto. I'm not sure, but I think it's just the battery and lights. And then the start position, you should have continuity between B and S. So battery terminal and starter terminal. So that's a quick way to check the key switch. If you don't have continuity in those terminals and in those positions, your key switch is probably to blame, and that's why you're not getting power down to the wire and not allowing the solenoid to close. So just a quick check. Some switches might be different, but that's kind of the basics on like most riding tractors you'll see. Once you take that prong off and the key switch out, you'll actually see the letters I was talking about engraved on the little terminals. So it's pretty easy to just take a continuity tester or a multimeter if you have one and do that test. Once you've got that established, it's not a key switch. If you got 10.2 or 9.6 volts at that little wire down there, I know sometimes it's kind of hard to get at. If you have a test light, you can also try that. But if you have voltage there, your solenoid is possibly to blame, or the starter. So another check you can do is take your multimeter or test light, and when it's in the crank position, hold your positive to the starter terminal and negative to a known ground, and see if you have 10.2 or 9.6 volts at the starter. If you have 9.6 volts or more and it's still not turning over, your starter motor is probably at fault and you should replace the starter. If you don't have 9.6 volts or you have like 5 volts or 4 volts, you probably have high resistance somewhere in your circuit. So you have corrosion or a loose terminal somewhere before the starter. So you're going to have to do some backtracking. One test that I'll do right away, that's kind of what I'll do right away. I just wanted to do it, explaining it step by step. But if you wanted to just cut right to the chase, you can either do that one, like I said, where you hold it in the crank position and check to see if there's power at that one small terminal on the solenoid, the hot terminal. That's a quick way to check to make sure your safety switches aren't at fault. So if you've got power there, you know your circuitry for your safeties and your fuses is probably good. Now, if you want to go right to the battery, or from the negative to the starter post, and you don't have any voltage, you got to go backwards from there. So if you do it step by step, you might have better luck. But if you want to do it right away, just going there and checking if there's voltage, you might give a better idea. Then you can at least not blame the starter right away, because a lot of people will have a no crank and they'll just immediately replace the battery and the starter, and they don't find the problem because they didn't actually check the wiring, or they had loose terminals or high resistance somewhere, or a bad key switch, bad starter solenoid. The most common things you'll see is a bad battery, and occasionally the starter solenoid will go bad. But I've been doing a lot of starter repairs lately where they will just be like internally shorted. So I'll put an amp clamp on it and I'll get a really high number of amps. Typical amperage rating on one of these would probably be like 40 to 50 amps, possibly more on something that's heavier duty. but I would say 40 to 50 amps. And I was getting probably like 150 to 200 amps. And the starter was cranking really slow. So I've had that happen a few times now. So it isn't uncommon to replace starters, guys. You guys can see this is a new starter because the shaft on the armature was all worn out and the gears are already getting stripped because the flywheel teeth are hitting this one. So don't mind that. I'm well aware of that. But like I said, the basics of the electrical system are just battery, starter solenoid, safety switches, fuses, and the starter motor, and the key switch. That all kind of plays a factor in the starting system. Check to see if you have power at that little terminal in the crank position on the solenoid. That's going to tell you that your circuit is working and the key switch is sending power to that terminal, because basically that comes from the key switch. That little terminal that comes from your S position on the key switch, which is under that coupling up there, basically goes down to that solenoid and tells the solenoid, hey, the safeties are not an issue, they're okay to start, the PTO is not engaged, the seats, I'm sitting on the seat, the brake is down, I'm going to send my voltage to the solenoid, trying to make the contacts click, sending power to the starter motor. So that's basically how the starting system works. When you guys are getting that clicking noise, when you turn the key to the crank position and it goes click click, usually, not saying always, you don't have enough power going to the starter solenoid to fully engage the contacts, or the starter solenoid is worn out and the contacts are wore and they aren't making a full connection sending power to the starter motor. So if you get the clicking, you definitely have some voltage going there, but you need either a 12 volt test light or a multimeter is best to actually check how much power is coming into the solenoid and if power is actually getting to the starter motor. Because if there's no power getting to the starter motor and there's power coming to the solenoid, then the solenoid is at fault because it's not sending the power from the battery and the key switch to the starter. So that's kind of a diagnostic procedure that I would use on a no start, no crank, kind of the diagnostic procedure I would use to kind of find out what the problem is. Don't just throw parts at it, guys. Get yourself a few tools like a multimeter or a test light if you can't get a multimeter. The test light will at least get you by. But multimeter is nice because you can do continuity and voltage and stuff like that. So just want to do a nice quick how-to video on how to diagnose, because this comes up quite a lot and it might even happen to you if you guys are a homeowner watching this and your lawnmower does this. You might have an idea of how to actually solve the problem instead of taking it to the dealer where they're going to charge you an arm and a leg because you had a bad battery or you had a dirty connection or a bad starter. Because these starters, really, you can get the aftermarket starters and they're not that expensive, and starter solenoids are also not that expensive. So just keep these things in mind when you guys have this problem, or if you're facing this problem currently. Try to follow my diagnostic procedure. I was kind of all over the place a little bit, but if you can pick up bits and pieces of what I was trying to say, you guys should be okay. Just remember the basics of clean battery connections, a good battery, and always go from there. And making sure those safety switches are not causing you any trouble, because that can be a problem. Also, make sure the engine's not seized up when you guys are trying to do this either. So always, either spin the flywheel a little bit, just to make sure that's not a problem, because, the starter could engage and it can't turn the engine over. So you don't know if it's actually working or not. So just be sure to check that if you're unsure if it may be seized up or not, because that could happen. But anyways, that's going to be it for the video. Hopefully you guys learned a thing or two and can actually do this procedure on your own and try to do it and help out people, maybe help yourself out if you run into this problem. Once again, leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you guys are new, leave a comment down below what you guys thought of this video. Should I make more of these how-tos on lawn equipment, or anything else you guys want me to make how-to on electrical, carburation, stuff like that? I can definitely do that. But stay tuned to the channel for more videos. We'll see you in the next one.